everyone, I'm Wayne and this is the first in my Origami Studio tutorial series. We're going to be covering the basics today. And by that I mean we're going to do a very short UI overview of origami. I'm not going to go into depth into every detail, I'm just going to give you enough to get started. And this is also going to be assuming that you know another design tool, but probably more specifically Figma. I'm probably going to be referencing those patterns more often. And we're just going to breeze by that UI overview and then spend the rest of the time building this prototype that we have in front of us right here. So this is a really simple prototype. We're going to show you all it does right here. We have a basic 2-day app and we have a button to trigger what would presumably be a create dialog here, or popover. It's a popover, let's say. I didn't even bother putting in what's in the contents here because this is really just about the transition point and the trigger animation and interaction here and how that looks. So the reason that I chose this kind of pattern is you can imagine how you would do something very similar in Figma. Now, you wouldn't be able to do all the details of it, the responsiveness of it, subtle bits of like the motion and the masking, I think would be trickier to do, but you can do most of it. And I think there's probably going to be something useful in terms of comparing how you would imagine you do that in Figma versus how you end up doing it in Origami Studio. And by doing that, we're going to cover a lot of the basics that are probably like 80% of what you do repeatedly in Origami Studio are like a couple of very basic ideas. And you just are able to evolve in different ways by getting creative with your actual ideas and assets and stuff like that. So that's why I think this should be a good primer on the basics of Origami Studio. So we will start from scratch after the UI overview, but I'm going to use this as the UI overview file right now. Okay, so let's start. Let's show everything in this thing first. Okay, we have a couple things on here. First, the most prominent thing that we've been showing before is the actual preview of your device. So this is going to actually represent every state and the current interaction state of your prototype. It's a live view of it. In comparison to that, you'll also see your canvas view up here. I rarely use this view, but I'm going to explain how I believe it's supposed to be used here. So let's just make this larger here. So up here, you can also see that you have a view switch toggle, which I barely use because I'm always in patch view. But in canvas view, you can have multiple artboards. You can do things like do more screen to screen kind of transitions in here. And it's good for me, it's good for the initial layout of your assets onto the screen. However, if you noticed before, when I was interacting with the live view of the prototype, you're not seeing any changes in the canvas view. And that's why I don't end up using it, because after I do the initial layout, like this shows the initial default positioning of everything, but nothing else beyond that. And so much of my work happens beyond that default state. So at some point, there's just, well, I don't need to look at it anymore. So that's what this is. Let me now turn that off. Now this is replaced with the patch view. This is where all of your work happens, basically. So this is a quick preview of like the final version of what we're going to be aiming towards, and we'll build up towards pretty much exactly this. So this is going to be the newest thing that it's going to be best to learn by actually doing the rest of the tutorial. So I won't spend too much time on that. Basic interaction here is I double click anywhere and that brings up the patch library where you can put all these variations of patches onto the canvas and start connecting them. So that's the main thing you should know there. All right, now we are going to go over to the left. So here we have basically your layers panel. It's not that different from any other layers panel in any other tool that you've probably been using. You can see here that the types of stuff that we have here, we have an image asset, which is the background. And that's all just the exported background from Figma, because if I'm not going to be interacting with it for a prototype, I don't bother dissecting it and putting its individual parts in here. I just render the entire thing out as an image and drop it in there. Don't need to worry about it. I have a shape. There's a darkening mask that is being altered in opacity to darken the background when that pops up. Now I have another shape that is the mask. I'm just going to hit Command T, and that turns the animations into slow mode. So you can see everything in super slow motion. So you can see that there's a radial mask being used there to show and hide. And that's what this oval is. You can see it has a little tiny icon on the bottom left, indicating that it's being used as a mask. The popover is an image asset that is being masked, and we have groups. Worth noting that the groups are more similar to frames in Figma than they are to Figma groups, in that you have a lot of control over how these operate. Like you can change the bounds of them individually. So they can crop into whatever is contained within, or they can go well beyond the contents of whatever is within this grouping. And you have a whole bunch of other options as well. We'll get into it as we do the actual tutorial. Also, if you are mousing over any of these things, including groups, you will see that you have familiar things like show and hide, you have lock, but you also have this plus button. So this is more unique to Origami Studio. If you click on this, you'll see the ability to add several types of interactions. If you want to make this into like a scrollable area, if you want to make it draggable, if you want to tap, that's, again, most of the time you're probably going to be using that one. But this is a shortcut to do something that you can do within the patch view. It is, I'm just going to show you real quick here. Let's say we want tapping the background to do something. If I hit that and hit tap, this creates an interaction patch that is pre-populated with this background being entered into the properties here. Now I could just do the same thing by saying double click here and type in interaction patch. It's actually the first one, so I didn't need to do that, but that's how you typically use it. And then you could just select whatever layer you have there, and that's going to give you the same result. But it's cognitively a lot easier for me to just like find what I want to interact with and then just hit this with a shortcut. So I think that's a good shortcut that they did in the Origami Studio team. We're going to go over to the right here to the properties area. And this, again, is going to be pretty familiar to what you've seen in other tools. List of properties, positioning, except unlike Figma, you also have the Z index as well, so you can move things closer and further away. You can play with that. I wouldn't touch it for initial experimentation just because it adds complexity that you probably don't need to worry about, but it's there, and I do use it at some points. Sizing, anchors, all this good stuff, border radii. And the origami specific thing to point out here, just like in the layers area, mousing over is going to give you additional options. So you'll see a blue plus sign on any of these, and that enables you to then drop this property into your canvas and then modify it with other patches, make it more interactive. So if I put this enable one in here, now I have this blue property patch for enabling the temp BG, which I can now also modify through here directly, or a patch can do that by plugging into this. But it is now disabled for me interacting with it over here. And if I try and interact with it, it's just going to actually move me over to the corresponding property patch in the patch editor. And if I want to remove that, I can just delete it, harmless. Now I can enable it, or disable it here again. You also see things like size, where I could say, I just want to modify the width. So I'm going to drop that in here. Or I could want to modify both properties. Now I have a single property that has the width and height in one thing, and other patches are going to give you the option of doing that. Instead of just one number, they have a set of like 2 in terms of like a size. Here's a size patch. So I just opened up the property thing, typed in size, and here's the size thing. So I could say like 200 or whatever, 155, and then plug that in, and then that's going to work in a corresponding way. So that's going to be how you modify a lot of different things. Often it's actually kind of this left to right thing of, I have a button, I'm making an interaction patch, I'm trying to modify a property that I plop down from here, and sometimes the hit states get a little wonky on me. And then you're just trying to make things connect from an interaction point to a property. And you might be doing some funky stuff in between to make it seem right. But that is kind of how I conceptualize like the puzzle game aspect for me of origami, of making something work. Because I know that there's a way to make it work almost every time. It's just a matter of finding out how to do it. Okay, so cover that, cover the right side and the patch interface, but we're going to go more into that in the actual tutorial. There are a couple things on here that I forgot to mention. There is a restart prototype here, which I can click, and it's not going to do anything because there's nothing crazy going on here. If I did open this up, the default state of this is being closed, so that will close that out. You can also record this individual thing to a nicely cropped movie file if you want to plop that onto like another device mockup or whatever. And you can also do some fun stuff with displaying frames. So I hit Option D there to give you a frame. That can help also on iPhones, judging wear like that. The notches as well. And you can also do some nice stuff with putting in different variations of hands, which is nice. And they have good diverse hands here as well. I don't use that often for rare mockups. I used it for a thumbnail once, but hey, it's there for you. The frames are there for you, and that's all pretty fun. Okay, end of UI tour. We're going to do the rest by doing the tutorial. All right, let's get started with the actual tutorial of building this thing, this interaction state. And I have a blank file created here. So I've literally done nothing except create this file and rename it. First thing you might want to consider doing, over on the top right here, you'll see the device type. So I have designed the Figma file for an iPhone 13 Pro, which is 3090 wide by something tall. I can never remember. So I'm just going to make sure that's set there. Oh, 844 is what that says. It also says at 3x, which is helpful for when you're exporting from Figma, make sure that you're using the same multiplier for your export sizes as well. So 3x is what I've been using for the last little while. So we have our viewer here, and this is going to scale nicely. So don't worry about like what size it is. Depending on your monitor size is really what's going to matter here. But the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to open up the split view for the canvas again. We're going to just zoom in, hit Z, and then get the zoom tool, get in here. And we're just going to dump our assets in. We're going to start with a static layout without any interactions first. And we have here, it's really 3 assets. We have the background, we have the popover, and we have the icon of the plus sign. So we're going to create the missing parts. There's a background circle of that doesn't exist yet, which we'll make out of a shape. So I just dragged and dropped that in. You can see sometimes it's not going to land in the artboard. You can see it's above that. So I'm just going to drag those all into the artboard itself. Let's get the background positioned right first. Okay, so let's just offset a bit, but it should be the right size. So I'm just going to go into the positions and zero that out. Now we're pretty much good. Not going to need to touch that again. And the popover, I'm going to move this broadly around here. I did make this image asset overly large because it has a little subtle background or drop shadow to it. And at some point I just said, I'll make it full width so it's easier to actually position in the mockup, which, depending on what you're doing, something you can consider to make it a bit easier on yourself. And the plus sign here, which we cannot see because it is white, and sometimes that bugs me, so I'm just going to give a little bit of a stroke here to temporarily show it. So that's where the plus sign is, and now we're going to add another layer. So I'm going to close the canvas now because it's not how I work. I just get used to not having it available to me. I'm going to go over to this top left thing, insert, and we're going to insert an ellipse. I'm just going to click it, and it's going to drop into a default place at the top left here. So next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure this is going to be eventually under the plus sign. To make it all centered, I'm just going to center it up entirely. So 0, 0, X, Y, centered up. Also, I know that I want this to be 80 tall and wide. So I lock the aspect ratio there, 80 there. And for the plus sign, even though I know I'm going to move to the bottom eventually, I'm going to zero this out too. Anchor to center. And now it is positioned at least on the circle where I need it to be. Now I can get rid of that stroke because I can clearly see where it is now. Now I'm going to group these up. A little bit easier now because they are perfectly aligned. Select them, group them, and I'm going to change this name to the add button. Now these are nicely positioned in here, and because I've lined everything up, the group is going to try and contain everything that the area its children is covering, which means that it is just matching the oval, really. So here, that is 80 by 80. I'll go ahead and lock that aspect ratio just in case. But it defaulted over to the top left anchor point alignment, which gives us some unnecessary values here. So I'm going to just zero these out. And now I'm actually going to use the alignment point of bottom center. So that's closer to where I wanted it anyways. And now I just know that I need to offset it. So I'm just going to, I've done this several times. So I'm just going to say this is going to be negative 48 to get past the home swipe indicator on iOS devices. So let's say that's approximately right. And now that's in the right position. Now we're more or less ready to go here. Oh, you know what? One thing. I'm just going to change this to button VG in terms of circle name. And we're going to change that color to, I'm just going to eyedrop this color right here. All right, now we're more or less ready to go. I lied. Let's move the popover position a little bit lower. So if I go over to the field over on the top right, and I just click and start dragging left and right, you can modify the values on the fly. I'm just going to be eyeballing this. I'm sure for proper design, you're going to have specific values, but eyeball it. So I wanted this to make sure that it feels like it's being rooted by the button because it's going to come out of there. But I don't want it to be necessarily touching as well. Don't know why, just how I'm feeling right now. And now we have the basics of the layout in terms of, well, a mixed state here, because you would never see the popover without it being masked out, which is why it looks bad with white on white. So once again, I lied. Let's add this last bit of the layout here. Let's add a rectangle, which is going to be our mask. Another, let me just rename that, darkening mask. And now we are going to change the sizing of this. So we can also, instead of using specific values here, I can also say, start typing 100 and just type in 100% here. And that will try and expand there. So that is fully flush. We're going to change the color to fully dark. And now we're going to actually move this opacity. Instead of changing the opacity in the color, we're going to change the opacity here, which is a different independent value. And this is something that we're going to be using later on to change dynamically. So we're going to leave this fully transparent. But now it's in its proper spot here. Okay. Layout is done. Now we're going to start adding patches, creating interaction. So if you think about what we're doing here, there's two states. There's the off state, there's the on state. Off state with the popover not showing, and on when it shows up, and the darkening mask also appears, and the button is going to change state as well. So a lot of things are happening based on basically a 0 or 1 happening. So we're going to make sure that we have that in place first. So our trigger point, we know that this is the button that we're going to be using to do that. So let's start there. As I showed in the UI overview, we can go over to the add button here, tap here, and now we have an interaction button. Now, if I go ahead and just click on this, you'll see the patch is already hooked up and it is working. You can see that when I'm holding it down, the down state is in a checked spot or checked state, excuse me. And when I tap and release, this flashes. So another bit of UI overview here. That down state can stay in that kind of state while this is a pulse. The block and the circle is a pulse. So that is a single frame of rendering. It sends a signal basically. So this is something that you're going to use a lot across Origami. And that is probably going to be one of the concepts in general to get used to with Origami Studio, but it makes a lot of sense once you get into it. So let's not worry about too much about how to define that. What we are going to be, how I like to set this up when I'm trying to figure out a prototype really is, here's my start point. I mentioned this earlier, and let's find the endpoint here, which is we want the plus icon to rotate when it is in the open state, which we know is over under transform. You have the rotation properties. And if I just drag this around, you'll see that my icon is spinning. So that's what I want to be doing. It's the Z value here. And I want that to be eventually turning to 45. Great. So I'm just going to hover over here and add that here. And now we have our starting point and we have our ending point. And how we're going to get there is what we're going to do next. So we want this to be triggering on the tap, and we want something to be mapping basically a 0 to 1 to a 0 to 45. Let's do a switch first. So talked about how this was basically two states. That's a very common pattern, and we have a patch to do exactly that. We have a switch. So I'm going to drop that in here, connect tap to flip. Now, as I tap this, you can see that I am setting the switch on or off, toggling it, really. Perfect. We have, this is going to be, it seems so innocuous, but this is going to be the hub of everything that we're doing. Everything is going to be referring to this on or off state to figure out how it's supposed to behave or appear. So we have this essentially going from 0 to 1. And we want that to be mapped over to 0 to 45 over here. So here is a patch that you can use all the time as well. This is a transition patch. Transition, drop that in here. It always defaults to color. I wish it would default to numbers, but so with some of these patches, you can change the state of, or not the state, the type of information that's in them. So even though there's color right now, and we will use a color one later on, let's change this to number. And we're going to change this from start from 0 and end with 45. So when this is off, it'll be transmitting 0. When this is on, it'll be transmitting 45. And now we can just connect that over here. Let's see. Let's flip this. And there we go. On, 45 degrees, off, 0. So we're mostly the way there. The thing that we're missing is any sense of motion animation here, which we are going to put in between here. So the animation patches are pretty simple in how they work. I'm going to type in animation here, and I'm going to completely misspell it. We have a pop animation and we have a classic animation. These are the two that I'm just going to drop both of them in here so we can compare. Classic animation and just pop animation. So I'm usually using one of these two. There are other animations in there, but I think they're deprecated. They're just there for legacy reasons. These are the ones that you'd be using most of the time. And so they'd fit between this and your properties because whatever numbers are being put in here, it'll ease in a certain way or just transition in a certain way, depending on what you've configured it to do. So let's start with classic first because classic is very familiar to how other tools will do animation. You have the duration of it and you have a curve, which you can change from linear to often quad in out or quadratic out. Those are probably the ones I use the most. But let's stay with linear. And now we have a very boring but completely usable animation. That is too slow. Let's drop that down to 0.2 and let's give that the quad in out. Again, much better, real quick. See that feedback pretty immediate. But this is one of those fun things where I like experimenting with pop animations until it feels like way too excessive. Let's connect that over here. So you can see that this can be connected to multiple other patches, but this properties can only take from one place. So I'm going to drag that over here, and now it's replaced it. So I didn't have to get rid of my classic animation to experiment with something else. I just had to change what was connected. And often when I'm experimenting with trying to like get a certain feel, I might have a different series of patches along a branch, and I'll just disconnect that one and then reconnect another one and then just flip between them and experiment and get a feel for what feels right. Okay, back to the pop animation. So you'll see that it doesn't have a duration. It has more physics-based properties here. It has the speed and bounciness. So you're going to have to experiment with what feels right, but this at least enables you to overshoot your target value with a bit of springiness to it. So let's just see what that looks like. Because this isn't a lot of default value here. It looks very much like the classic animation, frankly, very similar to the quad in out. So let's amp that up. I usually amp this up by default to like 20 and say at least 20 and 10 for speed and bounciness. And now you can see just enough overshoot on the rotation to make it feel a little bit more lively. And even though it's a small detail, I kind of like that. So we're going to stick with that. So let's say we're going to stick with a pop animation. I'm just going to delete that classic animation. And here we are. Here is the interaction for changing the rotation of this icon. Before we go any further, I'm just going to drag across there. I'm going to right click on any of these patches here to bring up a context menu and say tidy up. And now it's a little bit more tidy. That is mostly useful. Sometimes it is a bit wacky with how it tidies up. So it's not the perfect magical solution to making everything organized. You can't just do a complex thing, grab everything and say tidy up. It'll create a hot mess. But for simple things like this of just spacing and alignment of patches, it works just fine. Okay. So we did this, and now we're going to do a whole lot of variations based on this. You're going to see how it's relatively easy to just keep building on top of one interaction that you've done. So next up, okay, let's start working on the color of the button. So you're going to see how similar this was. So again, we're going to go over to the actual thing we're trying to change here, the button BG, and we can see the color property over here. Click that in here, and let's just drop that down here. So now we're going to make sure we can see what we're trying to map this to. So again, I'm going to move this out just because it feels, this is core to this thing, and then this is more individual things that we're changing in this area. So we need another transition patch. If I also just select a patch that's already connected and I just hold down Option and drag it, it'll maintain some connections here. So that can be a little convenient. So I have a transition, except this is still 0 to 45. I'm going to change this to color. Then I have white to white. I'm going to grab this color here. Just grab this hex code by copying it up. Go over here. Drop that in here. I probably should have changed the alpha first. There we go. We have that color. And we're going to change this to an arbitrarily dark gray, like 75-ish% gray here, just to give us some kind of contrast with what we're working with. So I can already tell you that we're just going to go ahead and put an animation patch in here. I go with classic animations for things like colors and opacity often, because the idea of a color overshooting or opacity overshooting, which doesn't even make sense, is not worth playing with. So for the color one here, we're going to make sure that we change this animation type to color as well, so you can see the actual swatches. Now let's plug it in. We're also going to, I know this is, and this is just me from experience, I know that that duration was probably around 0.2 seconds. And linear, we'll see how that feels. All right, it's all plugged in. Let's change state. Cool. I mean, it looks pretty good. Maybe I'll check how the different curve will look like. It's so short, I couldn't really tell the difference. It's hard to tell sometimes with gradients specifically. Not gradients, but like color shifts. But it's good enough. I can always come back and change it. I think that's decent. Okay. One more thing that I want to add to this was an actual down state. So this button on a mobile device is being tapped with your thumb. So because of the size of that, usually for those kinds of buttons that are similar in size to your tap target or to your digits, you want that down state to often expand so you can still see it. If it shrinks down, it might get completely covered by your finger. So this is just a minor consideration, depends on whatever you're designing here. But let's say we're going to make this get bigger when it is being held down, and then it'll snap back when you release. So for this, instead of modifying the background or the individual icon, we're going to take the property from the group. So the way that these groups work in Origami is some of the properties, they trickle all the way down. And that can be particularly useful for scale. So if I just modify the scale of this folder, everything is going to scale down nicely in addition, while I still have individual controls, say over like the plus sign. If I'm going to adjust the scaling on that, then that will have its own independent scaling within there. So we're going to get that property, drop that down here. And now I'm going to drag transition, and we're going to go from, the scale is defaulting to 1. I like that as the default scale. And I'm either going to make it smaller or bigger. We said making it larger is based on some just interaction guidelines in terms of mobile devices. So we'll do that, and we're going to go ahead and go with a pop animation. We'll just drag that over, plug this value in, and plug this into the scale. We're probably done, honestly. Let's see how that feels, though. Oh, you know what? I made a mistake because I'm applying this based on the switch, which is completely wrong. I don't want that to happen. I mean, that's not completely off-putting, but it's not my intended direction here. I don't want this coming from the switch. Let's disconnect that. What I wanted to do was I wanted this on the down state. So let's grab this, and we're going to move this a little bit higher up here, and we're going to connect this over to the down state. I don't like it when wires cross over, so I'm going to move this over here. For now, we're going to clean this up even better later on. All right, now as I tap and hold, there we go. So you can see that pop animation is happening in both directions. It is constantly filtering that value going through and making sure that it has springiness, whatever it's doing. So that is on the grow and on the shrink. And I like that. It kind of feels like it's preloading the rotation, like it's kind of like building up energy, and then when it releases it, it ends up making that thing rotate somehow, which I'm into. So great. That is all the work that we're going to do on that button. So we're in good shape there. Let's just go ahead and move that over just so it's kind of organized. This is my button area, effectively. Oh, you know what? While we are here, I'm going to just select all of this stuff. And you might have seen on the context menu before, there's a comment around option here. So I'm going to hit that. And now we have a little box around this that I'm just going to call add button. And now we can grab this thing and we can move it around as a group. And that's how we start keeping things organized within Origami. All right. Next thing we're going to do a little bit of mask because I'm tired of seeing the white on white. I can barely see it. You should be able to guess how we're going to do this now. Pretty easy. Darkening mask, opacity, plop that value in. We are going to get a transition. We're going to get a classic animation. And we're going to go from 0 to 1. Actually, no, not to 1. We want, I often start with like 80%, don't know why, on these types of masks. Classic animation. I'll go ahead and let's see, quadratic in and out. Let's see how that feels. And here we go. Way too slow. Let's put it down to 0.2 because we are using 0.2 elsewhere. All right, not bad. So as a little side tweak here, we'll notice that in this on state, on's right, the button here and the background, kind of not great in terms of contrast. Maybe it would be better to adjust how this feels in terms of maybe lightening up if that's where our mask is going to be. So I don't want to clash too hard with the actual X button, X icon. So let's lighten that up a little bit. And let's say that's just fine. That's one of those tweaks that is just really easy to do in a live simulation in Origami. So I'm into that. And now we can see that this popover is contrasting quite nicely. Although now I'm going to do a little design change here because now I stare at this. Sometimes I like having a lighter darkening mask if I can still see a huge amount of the UI. Let's see just what 0.5 looks like here. Yeah. Basically, if this is a to-do list, and maybe I'll have like related kind of to-dos up there, I want to make sure that I'm creating focus for this popover while not making it difficult to read the underlying contents, which is my reasoning there. So because of that, I'm now actually going to move this in the other direction and darken out this button state. Back to around the, probably darker than its initial spot, maybe like 85%-ish dark. And here we go. That's a bit less intense, less of a bit of a slap in the face with the overall screen color change there. So that's feeling good. Okay. Last thing that we're going to do is actually change how the popover is showing. So let's go down. Oh, and you know what? Let's do a little bit of cleanup here. Comment around. Darkening mask. I know it's just the one thing, but it always helps to add a little bit of cleanliness to everything. All right. Now we're dealing with the popover. So could do a couple things. You'll see in the actual final prototype, we have a nice circular mask. But full disclosure, when I started the Origami prototype, I only had a loose idea. I just knew that, like, all right, I'm going to show the popover somehow. And we're going to play with some ideas, and I'll land on something that I actually enjoy, which is where the circular mask came in. But just to show you some iteration speed in terms of like how I think you would actually use Origami, first thing I did was the simplest, and that is moving the thing into position. I knew this probably wouldn't look right. I knew it wouldn't look right, but I wanted to just see how wrong it was, really. So we're going to grab the Y value for the position of the popover. Going to do we'll just grab with transition and classic animation. I know that the end position is 482, so I'll drop that in there. And I also know that wants to be pushed well below the bottom of the screen, so I'm going to give this a pretty large value. That might not be enough even, but we'll see. let's connect that. Okay, well, it's got pushed off the screen, so we got that going. And as I trigger that, it's going to go from 1200 to 482 with a classic animation. And it looks pretty crappy, as expected, but hey, now I've seen it. The second thing that I tried really quickly, I'm going to delete that property there. The second thing I tried was, all right, what if I scaled it up out of nothing? Let's grab the scale here, change this to 0 and 1, and we'll connect that. This also looks pretty crappy because the point of scaling origin seems to have no relationship to the actual asset itself. Like this is supposed to be rooted in this button, and yet it is being anchored out of this spot. So we can fix that really quickly. We're also going to do some fixing with the actual positioning here. I just dropped this into the canvas, so I didn't bother with proper anchoring. But really, I wanted this to be anchored from the bottom center. So I'm going to zero out that Y position, and that's just, while I'm in the field, I'm just going to hold down Shift and hit down to move by 10. And let's say 120 is where I'll be comfortable with right now. But now it is at least anchored there. But you can see that when I do the scale, it's still going through the center because it's not, that's using the positioning anchor point, but it's not using the pivot point for the, pivot points are used for the transforms as it's under the transform header. So let's just change that to bottom center. And boom, that's a lot closer. That's a lot closer to what we want. But it still feels goofy. It still feels cartoonish. And this is the thought process I had to, all right, well, maybe it should have more of a mask so we can minimize the sense of scale. So we just do a hint of scaling to make it give a little bit of motion, but it's not going to full, like I'm shrinking this down to nothing kind of feeling to it. So how are we going to do that? We have the Popover on its own here, and we are going to create a circular mask, which is just a ellipse shape here. Let's drop this in here. We're going to make this also bottom centered and going to move this up. Also, we're going to just for visibility's sake, almost debugging sake, making that over there. Also, I'm going to try and center that up over the point here. You know what, to help this, I'm just going to scale it down to almost a dot. And now I can, you know, that was actually pretty good. Let's say that's where it is. So it's going to mask from there and outwards. So I'm going to reset the scale. And now, because I know that I want this to actually act as a mask, well, first of all, I'm going to put this all together, pop over an oval and group that into, just maybe this Popover group, gripe. Can't stand making the typos in a recorded tutorial. Change this oval to mask. And also, just because I'm kind of a stickler for this, when I made the group, it uses the default anchor positions. Again, bottom center, I think it was I don't know, it was probably like minus 120 is where, you know what? So that included the circle, so now it's offset. I'm gonna say, I made it closer there than it was before. But now this group is in its proper position, and these are now relative to that. But you see that the mask, everything that's going to be within the circle is what I want to be visible, even though that's not being apparent right now. Let's just make that fully opaque again. So we're going to keep the circular aspect ratio. I'm just going to pump this up. I'm going to pump this way up. Also seeing that, oddly, it was not scaling uniformly from where I wanted it to scale. So you know what? I'm going to have to adjust that center point again and make sure that this is approximately over that. Yeah, that looks about right. So this seems a little offset. Yeah, it's offset from the center. I don't know why that is the case, because it looks like it should be perfectly centered. I don't know what the deal is. Anyways, good enough for a quick mask. we are going to make sure that the size of this is going to fully encompass that popover. Also, as groups clip by default, I'm going to undo that. So I made this even larger than the bounds of this because, as a reminder, there's a subtle shadow, so I don't want to have that being oddly clipped. So I'm going to make sure the mask is much larger. Okay. So I'm going to leave this as, before I mask it, I'm going to leave this out here so you can see how that motion is going to be turned into an animation here. And we set up the sizing here so we could then just adjust the scale with the animation property. So that's going to go from 0 to 1 when we are opening this up and therefore showing this at the same time. So let's start there. Scale, mask scale. I'm going to say popover mask, just to give us more legible properties over here. We know that we actually are doing a 0 to 1 transition. And we're also doing a pop animation here. So I'm just going to now reconnect these, or connect these properly rather. And maybe this will be right. Let's, cool. Also, we did this so we wouldn't have to go from 0 to 1 on the popover scaling. So I'm just going to adjust that to 0.8 when it's closed. Cool. So it has a really nice springy effect to the mask, which I'm into, but let's see how this looks like when it is actually masking. So we're going to go over here to the mask, I'm going to right click and use as mask. Cool. It's going a little quick, honestly. Maybe, you know what, for a mask, I decided that I don't want any kind of spring back, so I'm going to go to a classic animation. Give us more time and control to adjust to coordinate with the scaling of the actual popover. This was about 2.2 in all the other cases I was using, so let's see how that looks. There, that's nice and smooth. It's a little less, maybe a little too erratic with that pop animation, but this is it. This is where we got to with the demo I showed up front. It's not that complicated. Also, let me just tidy these up. Put these in a little comment block here. Name this popover. And here we are. Now, I'm going to show you how to clean this up a bit, because one of the things that ends up happening with origami, as I mentioned before, this switch state is very central to, the state of this entire prototype. And the benefits of visual scripting is that you can see how everything connects. So if I came back to this after a couple of weeks, I could just repeatedly, play with this a bit, and I could see where the connections are and how this works and trying to get back up to speed. However, sometimes with really complex prototypes, because you have very centralized state things, you can end up with stuff like over here, and now you have wires crossing over other patches, and that can get annoying. So one thing that I do like to do, even when on the fly, that I held off on doing right now just to keep things simple, but we're going to talk about variables. So variables are a pair of two different patches, a variable broadcaster and receiver. I'll show you how this works by using them. I'm going to make a broadcaster first, and we're going to call this, let's say, popover state. Variables can be any kind of type. I'm going to change this to Boolean because it is representing a Boolean state, on or off. And now I'm going to plug the switch into popover state. So now this is just reflecting what that switch is. So it's not doing anything smart. However, what this is going to allow me to do is now I'm going to go back into the patch library here, make a receiver. It defaults to the last one I created, so that's popover state. But now this is a disconnected patch. It is, I guess that is exactly what this icon is playing. It's a wireless signal, I guess. But let's expand this add button here. I'm going to make a bit of room. And we're going to drop this in here. And now we're going to connect this popover state into all of these as well, because it's doing the same data, except we've disconnected the wires of this, which is, I really just realized the wireless thing. And that's a fun little clever element to it. So, oh, this is fun too. tidy up, sometimes it just makes all of this go completely nuts in terms of the comment boxes. So watch out for that. But now we have a very individual fragment of functionality here. And we can keep doing this. That's the same idea with this mask. I'm just going to drag this popover state there. Connect that there. And we're going to a point where we don't have to have wires crossing over. This is also using popover state. I could use one of these popover state things and just connect them all, but then I'd be having a bunch of wires connecting everywhere again, which would defeat the purpose of what I'm trying to do. Again, it gets a little funky with the sizing of this on the default cleanup. Cool. So I feel like I missed something here. What did I do with the... Oh, you know what? I broke the down state. The scale of the button, that's what I forgot I just did. So that's supposed to be getting the down state, and that's not connected to anything. So let's make another variable. Let's do another variable broadcaster, add down state. Change this to another Boolean as well. Connect that in here. And now this is just our core little interaction base. And I'm going to copy that over here, change this variable to refer to the down state, and connect that there. Okay, so now we have either the switch state or the actual down state of that button. And now we have these isolated groups of functionality, all mostly neat. This might mess up the comment box again, but let's see. Yep, it did again. So watch for that. Otherwise, I can make a hot mess of things. But here we are. Now, let's add some other stuff. This isn't going to be apparent in the tutorial, but I encourage you to try this as well. Haptics. I love haptics. It's fun to see where they are, and it's fun to see where you've done entirely too many haptics at some point. But I think the switch, whether it's being turned on or off, is a good spot for that. You can probably guess where we're going to want to do this at this point. Let's say, I still want to put this in the add button. I'm pretty sure it's going to be triggered from this. So whenever this is changing, essentially, whether it is changing from on to off or off to on. So there's a patch for that. We want to create a pulse. Actually, let's start with the endpoint here. So open the library, type in Haptic, and here's Haptic iOS. So you can see in our destination that this is a pulse input. So we want to generate a pulse to trigger it. So what we're going to do here is look up pulse. We have a couple. Pulse, pulse on change, repeating pulse. I'm going to go with pulse on change. So anytime this value changes, whether on or off, it'll create a pulse. So you can see there, pulse. And now we just wire that up here. And now, even though you can't feel that from the YouTube video, but it is pulsing. As a fun side note here, Mac laptop trackpads and even the wireless trackpad, these have haptics on them. So, and these are going to take that haptic patch input as well, or output. So if you want to test that stuff without hooking up your device, you can also use your trackpads to get a feel for that. Okay, so now that thing is doing haptics. And even though I'm not going to, I won't have a supplied sound effect, if you want to try sound, now you should be able to see that it works in exactly the same way. Double click in here, just look up sound. There's a sound player patch. And I would, well, I won't have a sound, so it's not going to play anything, but I would hook up the play. And then I would load in the sound file. And it would play. Although I think this is actually not a pulse, so you might actually have to change this to a switch. So this might be more of another switch interaction where you're pulsing to turn something on. But you know, you can figure that out, hopefully, at this point. It's all pretty simple, based off the same general ideas. You have switches on one side, you have properties you're trying to change, and you have a whole bunch of stuff in between. Okay. I think that's everything that I wanted to cover. Now I think, oh, you know, one more thing that I'll do just for cleanliness here. Not the most exciting thing, but because I like trying to group everything at some point, I'll put this in a comment block. Trigger interaction. And I'm going to change this to a different color. Just as a highlighter, I use the colors very occasionally to highlight things. but it helps feel like it is a little bit neater. This is out of alignment, which is going to drive me nuts. So this is our patch thing. One other tip I forgot to mention. If you are, say, trying to get a sense for how this feels in terms of the motion, and you might be tired of just coming over here and clicking all the time, pulses. We can replace our interaction with I'll just search pulse. You saw this before, repeating pulse. And I'm going to wire this up to the flip. So every second, it's going to trigger. So now hands off. And the button is opening and closing. And I can just kind of like stare at it, get a feel for the motion, be like, no, it's fine. So that's a little trick you can use on occasion if your prototype is built for that stuff. I'm going to wire that back up to the flip and get rid of this pulse. So it's back to normal. But that's how you use Origami Studio. As a side note, which I forgot to cover earlier on, if you have the Origami Live app on your phone and you just connect it with a cable, it will just start mirroring what's on your actual prototype. And I'm waiting for it to show up, but sometimes you do have to do a little restart and force quit with the Origami Live app. And when you launch it, it'll pick up your prototype mirror. And now it is doing everything that you can here. And you're also getting the haptics, and this is also how you're going to get gyroscope input in the future as well. You'll need a device for that. Or you can fake it with other values, but it's just way easier and probably more realistic to hook up your phone anyways. So often when I'm doing an Origami Studio session, I just have my phone connected in case I need to get a feel for it. Just pick up my device and get a feel on the actual device of how things are actually working. So that's it. Those are the basics of Origami Studio. I hope that was helpful. Again, it's a pretty simple thing, but yeah, it's the same pattern in a way across a whole bunch of different things. You're tweaking values here, you're tweaking animation speeds, but that can be like 80% of what you're doing here. And it has some really great results from that. So that's the basics. If you've been watching, thank you for watching. Got more coming up next. The next one I'm going to do is the origami wallet, where we had the gyroscope interacting with the motion and creating the illusion of material and lighting. As a spoiler, it's mostly these ideas, except using gyroscope on the left side as the input and using a series of masks, and also blend modes, which I forgot to mention. One of the nice things about origami is that it has the full range of blend modes that you'd see in Figma, especially things like overlay and multiply and screen, which are the ones I'd use the most. So that can translate really nicely from a Figma design and help you create some interesting effects like we will be doing in the next tutorial as well. Okay. That's it. Thanks, everyone. If you like this, please like and subscribe for the next one coming out. But I appreciate you all. All right. Thank you. Bye now.